that for me personally, the birthplace of real radical transformation is relationship.
The birthplace of transformation is relationship.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if we might just start, Shannon, by you sort of introducing yourself, whatever that is that you want to say about yourself. But I'm going to invite you just to start by introducing yourself.
Sure. It's wonderful. The first thing I'd say is I am a passionate, empathic connector. And I am passionate about building mutually transformative relationships. And that has taken a variety of different shapes and forms over the course of my life. Time in intentional communities, time working in social service, time in seminary, time as a performer, and more recently, time as the executive director of the Gubbio Project, which we're here to talk about. So the Gubbio Project has this really beautiful origin. So it's named after, as you mentioned, the town in Italy where St. Francis is reported to have mediated this truce between townspeople and this hungry wolf, and through the finding of common ground, there is transformation possible, and peace and healing. And so in San Francisco, there is a massive crisis of homelessness. And there's one neighborhood called the Tenderloin, where there is a parish called St. Boniface, a Catholic parish. And Father Louis Vitale, who you may have heard of as sort of a notorious social justice warrior, arrested, I think, over 400 times for various different causes. He was assigned to this parish in the Tenderloin, a historically terribly neglected neighborhood. And he would go out every morning before opening up the gates of the church and would visit with the people that were camped out on the side of the street, and just built relationships over days and weeks and months. And from that, he learned that there was a lack of space for people during the day. There are shelter programs at night, but like here, you have to be out of them by a specific time. And there are sit-lie laws in San Francisco where you can...
A sit-lie law? What is that?
So you can be fined for sitting or lying on the pavement during the day. And as we know, many of our kin who are trying to live on the streets, they don't have a lot of expendable income to just be paying off fines for sitting on the street. And the quality of sleep that folks get on the streets is terrible. It's not safe. People sometimes take things to stay awake, to protect themselves and their belongings, or their pets, or their loved ones. And even if they do happen to have a bed in a shelter, the quality of sleep in a shelter is not great. So he looked around at this huge empty church that he had and thought, why don't I welcome these folks in? They're saying they need space, they need quiet, they need respite, they need sanctuary. So that was the sort of seed of Gubbio, and it, practically speaking, what it looks like now is partnering with a variety of different churches, sanctuaries such as this, welcoming folks in, housed and unhoused, to experience the sanctuary space. And it's mostly filled with sounds of snoring people and incense burning. It grew into providing a variety of other, connections to social services and some nursing care and harm reduction services. A really unique model of peer support and social justice, harm reduction, but all rooted in those Christian values of welcome and hospitality and sanctuary.
As you sort of think back on your life, is there a moment in your life where you can connect those dots? How you got to the Gubbio Project out in San Francisco?
That's such a good question. I think there were a lot of little moments. A personal health and mental health crisis that forced me to reevaluate my life and my choices, and an experience living in the large communities, which your community might know, and a relationship in that community with a very specific woman named Jillian. She had lived most of her life in an institution where she experienced all manner of abuse and neglect, and she came to live in a large community, and we shared a home together for the last 3 years of her life. She broke down a lot of my preconceived ideas about how we make change, how we evolve and grow, how we build relationships, which in turn I think sent me on this path of service, of tending to this burgeoning spirit that was, calling to me, in me, through me. I happened to be in between careers, and I saw that they were looking for an executive director. And I think from the moment I saw they were looking to the moment I accepted the position was a matter of 48 hours. It all happened very, very quickly. There was a lot of momentum and flow of spirit. And sort of jumped right in and was at the church, the first church there too, a week later, and was building relationships with the peer support, who are the folks that sort of monitor the space, and our guests, because we use the term guest for all of the folks that come in to use the space.
What are the stories that will live in you and in whoever you meet going forward as a result?
So many. The first that comes to mind is a young woman who came in early one morning at 6 a.m. who was fleeing a domestic violence situation, and she showed up with her 2-month-old baby. And I'll call him Baby K. And she hadn't slept for days. They had been in their car, and they had heard from another agency that we were offering sanctuary. And she came in and just said, "Just please hold him." And I sat in the pew beside her while she slept and just held her baby. And I thought, if there is ever a reason why this exists, this is it here. So she could get up her strength to then follow up on some of the resources we gave her, get a meal, get herself a change of clothes, get her baby the things that she needs, like you do here. Simple things. I'm thinking about another gentleman, Arthur, who would come in every day, and he and I would sit in the back of the church and we'd talk about movies, talk about our favorite superhero movies. I miss him tremendously. He ended up, when COVID hit, he ended up getting one of the shelter-in-place hotels in the city that we were all advocating the city open up to help protect our unhoused neighbors who were at an increased risk.
Yeah, our risks here, the risk of getting COVID from the shelter system here was 20 times higher than the general population.
Wow, 20 times.
Yeah, and a much higher rate of mortality among the unhoused who got COVID.
One thing we saw in the Bay was when you take people out of their community, their encampment or their tent community, and put them in isolated rooms, the risk of overdose goes up because they're using alone.
Yeah.
So all these residual impacts.
In fact, the folks at Trinity Bellwoods who were fighting the eviction notice were fighting that notice in part because they had, many of them had been in the hotel shelters, had seen their friends dying, had seen more people die in the hotels from the opioid crisis in particular, because they were pulled away from their communities of care. While you solved the problem of temporary shelter, we created another system whereby we'd broken apart, you spoke of relationships, right? We'd broken apart those relationships that kept people safe, connected, fed, knowing where the next place to go to get food was, all of that stuff broke down. In Toronto, a lot of the shelters had to reorganize and shift and change, and some of them had to close. And I know that Gubbio had to change. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was very hard. The Gubbio was started 17 years ago as a project of the Catholic Church, that specific church. And then it incorporated into a nonprofit several years later. While we were functioning as a nonprofit within the church walls, we still had very strong ties to the community there. And as the situation with COVID unfolded and the church community learned more about the potential risks, the St. Boniface community was increasingly uncomfortable with us operating there. The Gubbio Project stayed open significantly later than many of the other providers in the neighborhood, and we saw our population of guests increase from, on any given day, sort of 50 to about 140.
It's almost 3 times
in the space. And at a time of pandemic, the risk was quite high. So we, for a variety of reasons, had to temporarily close. And offered some modified services out of our second site for a while. But ultimately there is still that place of great pain, that something that mattered so much was required to be put on pause. I had the honor of meeting Father Louis Vitale very briefly, and one of his colleagues before COVID. We had just lost a gentleman to an overdose death in one of the pews. And the community was grieving that experience and figuring out how to hold it. And I said to this father, I don't know how to hold this amount of suffering. I can't see it all. And he said, let it soften you. Let it soften you. Let it soften you. And I just stood there listening to him cry and cry and cry. There is something, as you said, transformative that can come when we can stay with that Christ crucified and allow it to move us and change our hearts. Not just change our hearts, but change our hearts and move us into action. I think the way becomes clear when relationship is held at the center. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the way becomes clear when relationship is held at the center.
Yeah.
So thank you, Shannon.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. It's an absolute blessing. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was a ramble.
That was beautiful.